So, it's time for another installment of Weird Things in History, and this time it's weird war names. So, let's get right into it. The Whiskey War. So, this was a border conflict fought between the unlikely nations of Denmark and Canada, and they were fighting over an island called Hans Island between Danish Greenland and the Canadian Ellesmere Island. And the conflict actually began in the 1930s over where the border should be. And theoretically it should run down the middle of the island, but this was not agreeable for either of the two nations. So people thought the fighting over this island was over in 1973 because both nations decided to sign a border treaty. But the treaty just forgot about a portion of the island, so guess what? They went back to fighting. And in 1984, Canada made a move for the land, planting a flag reading "Welcome to Canada," and then, iconically, leaving some Canadian club whiskey in a bottle next to the sign. The Danish retaliated, removed the Canadian items, and instead replaced it with a bottle of schnapps and a sign in Danish, which read "Welcome to this Danish island." And this continued back and forth for just over 2 decades, with each side receiving leaving larger and higher quality things behind each time round. And then finally, in 2005, they came to an agreement and stopped fighting. But do you know what the best part about this whole conflict is? Hans Island is a barren, rocky and uninhabitable place and does not have any particular use for either side. The War of Jenkins' Ear. The year is 1738, and Robert Jenkins stands before the British Parliament. Then he pulls out a rotting ear. He claims that the Spanish Naval Coast Guard in the Caribbean has cut off his ear as he was a smuggler. And this happened about 7 years before he went to the British Parliament, so I'm guessing that the ear must have been pretty disgusting at that point. The British Parliament was irate, and logically declared war on Spain. And the war was mainly fought in Florida and Georgia, which are both Spanish and British colonies respectively. The conflict eventually morphed to become one with the War of the Austrian Succession because the British and the Spanish were pitted on opposite sides of that. And spoiler alert, nobody really won that war, except Prussia, who took some land off Austria. The Pig War. So now we jump forward about a century to 1859. Lyman Cutler is a farmer that lives on the island of San Juan, between Seattle and Vancouver, and this island is disputed between the Americans and the British ever since the Oregon Treaty was signed. So one morning the farmer wakes up and he sees a pig just eating through all the potatoes that he's growing on his farm. So he gets out his gun and shoots the pig. What he doesn't know about this pig, though, is that it belonged to his neighbour Charles Griffin, who was employed by the Hudson Bay Company, so that's a British company, to keep livestock on the island. So Cutler's quite a nice guy. He decides, yeah, you know what, I'll offer you some compensation. So he offers compensation of about $10, which, before you laugh, is about $300 today. Griffin doesn't accept this, and he demands instead 10 times as much, so $100 back then, which would probably be about $3,000 today, which is quite a lot for a pig. And obviously Cutler does not want to pay this amount. So British authorities and American troops are then called to the island to settle the situation, because at this point in time, the Hudson Bay Company, which is the British company, has operations on the island, and there's about 30 Americans living on the island as well. So both sides wanted to have their own, I suppose, authorities protecting them. Camps were set up at opposite ends of the island, so the Americans had about 460 men, and then the British amassed about 2,140 Royal Marines. Both nations eventually decided they didn't want an all-out war because of a pig, so they withdrew all troops but 100 men on each side of the island while they negotiated, and in the end it was decided that the island actually belonged to America. So a war nearly started because of a pig. The War of the Stray Dog. So yeah, it's a bit of a theme of animals here now. So it's the 1920s, and World War I is over, so surely there'll be a lasting peace in Europe. No! In 1925, a dog runs over the Greek border and into Bulgaria. And his supervisor, a Greek soldier, thinks, well, I can't lose my dog, so he runs after the dog, crossing into Bulgaria. And there was already quite a lot of tension between Bulgaria and Greece. I mean, Greece had some land, or at least got some land off of Bulgaria after the end of the First World War. So yeah, there was a lot of tension there. And so the Greek soldier was then shot for crossing the border. Greece wasn't happy about their soldier being shot, so they decided to invade Bulgaria and occupied some southern towns. And it took a concerted effort from the international cooperation within the League of Nations to step in and stop the conflict becoming the next Balkan War. A ceasefire was later agreed, but not before 50 people had been killed. The War of the Bucket. So now we jump back quite a long way to 1325 in Italy. And at this point in time, Italy is far from a unified country. It's more of a peninsula of semi-independent city-states that squabble amongst themselves. And two of these city-states in question were Modena and Bologna. And guess what? There's another border conflict. Bologna was claiming more and more land that Bologna was claiming more and more land that Modena considered themselves to own. And both cities then sought external backing because they weren't particularly powerful themselves. So Bologna snuggles up with the Pope and Modena with the Holy Roman Emperor. There was actually only one battle in this installment of the war, called the Battle of Zappolino. Bologna had approximately an army of 32,000. They decided to engage the soldiers of Modena, who had then crossed into what they considered to be Bolognian territory. And even though the battle was in Bologna, the Bolognese lost. And most of the 2,000 soldiers killed were from Bologna. So Bologna decided to retreat back into their city because they were at risk of being completely shattered. And the war actually gets its name because the victorious Modenan army steals a bucket from the city gate as a victory prize. So thank you for watching. Please give this video a like, and if you want to keep up to date with content, I would recommend subscribing. So I will see you in the next one.